Okay, so I want you to picture something with me. Imagine a single thread.
Uh-huh.
Just one super long, unbroken thread. It starts way back in a garden like the Garden of Eden, and it winds its way through thousands of years of history.
Okay.
It goes through deserts, up into freezing mountain caves, across oceans on those creaky wooden ships, and it ends up, well, potentially right here, today.
That is quite the visual to start us off. I assume we aren't doing a deep dive into the history of textiles?
Not exactly. We are talking about history, but a very specific kind of history. I've been reading through Section 1 of the Church Heritage Manual, and honestly, it forces you to completely rethink how you visualize time. The hook here, the thing that really grabs you, is that this source argues for a single, unified group of people. A church that shares the exact same spiritual DNA from Adam and Eve all the way to the modern world.
It is a fascinating premise, and it really challenges the way we usually categorize history. Most of us are used to chopping things up into boxes, you know?
Oh, totally.
You have the Old Testament box, the New Testament box, the Dark Ages, the Reformation. They feel like completely different worlds, almost different religions sometimes.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
always thought of them as separate chapters.
Mm-hmm.
But the source material we are looking at today argues that while the names, locations, and languages change, the core identity never did. It's one story.
Right. And just a quick heads up for our listener before we get too deep. Our mission today is to unpack Section 1 of this specific document.
Yeah.
We are acting as impartial reporters here. We want to understand this specific worldview, tracing the thread as they see it without endorsing it or debating it. We're just seeing where the logic leads.
Oh, let's start where it all begins. The text explicitly says God's church stretches from Eden to Eden, which I have to admit threw me off a bit.
So,
Usually when I hear church, I think of the apostles, the New Testament, buildings with steeples. I don't think of Adam and Eve.
that is a common distinction, but this manual argues it's a false one. It asserts that the church is simply the collection of God's faithful people, regardless of the era. The text lists the various names this group has held over the millennia: sons of God, seed of Abraham, children of Israel, and eventually Christians.
Okay, but this is where I got stuck. Because if you go to most Sunday schools, you learn that there's a pretty hard line between the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
The Old Testament is all about strict laws and rules, and the New Testament is about grace and forgiveness. They feel like opposites.
That is the standard view, yes. But here is where the text makes its first major theological argument. It asserts that that distinction is actually incorrect.
Really?
The source argues that God has always maintained a harmony of law and grace. They argue you can't have one without the other.
So they're saying the Old Testament folks weren't just trying to earn their way to heaven by following rules.
Precisely. The manual states that the Ten Commandments are an expression of God's character. Since God's character is universal and unchangeable, the law is too. It even points out a really interesting detail. It notes that Abraham kept the commandments long before Moses ever went up Mount Sinai.
That is a surprising detail. I always associate the commandments with Moses. But if the law was always there, what about salvation? I think most people picture the Old Testament as sacrifice a goat and you're good, whereas the New Testament is believe in Jesus.
This text flips that idea on its head. It says there has only ever been one method of salvation: faith in the Messiah.
The Old Testament guys were sacrificing lambs. They weren't talking about Jesus.
They were, but in a different way. The text uses a really helpful analogy here.
Okay.
It argues that those sacrifices were a symbol looking forward to the Lamb of God. So the Old Testament believer looked forward to the cross by faith. The New Testament believer looks backward to the cross by faith.
Oh, I see. It's the same event. The cross is in the middle, and everyone is looking at it, just from different sides of the timeline.
Exactly. Same faith, same event, just a different direction of sight.
That actually makes a lot of sense within their logic.
Ah.
So, fast forward a bit. We get to the New Testament. Jesus comes, and according to this text, he isn't there to destroy the old system, but to fulfill it.
Right. And then we see the organization of the Apostolic Church. And what's fascinating to me is that the manual describes it using very modern administrative terms.
It does.
It calls James the first general president and notes that the headquarters were in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that stood out to me too. It sounds very corporate, but I guess it shows they were organized, they had deacons, a hierarchy, and a very specific commission to preach the gospel to every creature.
But as we know from history, as soon as they started doing that, the pushback began.
Pushback is putting it lightly. We move into what the source calls the era of persecution. It started immediately with Stephen being stoned, but then the Roman Empire gets involved and things get really dark.
Yeah.
The text highlights the period from AD 100 to 300 as the darkest hours.
But here is where the narrative shifts in a really interesting way. Usually you think of persecution as the worst thing that can happen to a movement.
Of course.
If you kill the followers, the movement dies, right?
That's the logic.
But the source suggests that the enemy of souls, referring to Satan, realized that strategy wasn't working. The more he persecuted them, the more the church grew. So he switched strategies.
If you can't beat them, join them.
Essentially, the strategy changed from persecution to compromise. The argument here is that persecution kept the church pure because nobody joins a group where you might get eaten by lions unless you really believe it.
Okay.
But when the church became popular with the state under Constantine and later leaders, pagan rites and ceremonies began to filter in.
And this leads us to the rise of the papacy. Now, the text gets very specific with dates here. It mentions a 1260-year prophecy. Can you break that down? Because when I read 1260 years, my eyes kind of glazed over.
It's actually a core part of their historical framework. The text links this to prophecies in the books of Daniel and Revelation. They identify 538 AD as the start of papal supremacy.
Okay, 538.
Then, based on the prophecy, they count forward 1260 years.
Okay, let me do some quick mental math. 538 plus 1260. That lands us on 1798.
Which the text notes as the year the Pope was taken prisoner by Napoleon's general, birth year. So they see a precise start and stop date for this era of dominance.
And that huge chunk of time in the middle, 538 to 1798.
Yeah.
That's what we usually call the Dark Ages.
Right. And the manual quotes the historian J.A. Wiley with a very evocative phrase.
What is it?
The noon of the papacy was the midnight of the world.
Wow. Midnight of the world. That is heavy. What made it so dark, according to them?
It refers to the suppression of information and the introduction of what the text calls false doctrines. It argues that the Bible was effectively locked away from the common people. And because people couldn't check the source material, tradition started to replace scripture. It lists things like the immortality of the soul, the worship of saints, purgatory.
And there's one big specific change they focus on, right? The day of worship.
Yes, this is a major point in the document. It states that Sunday observance came from paganism and was brought into the church during this era of compromise.
So not from the original church.
According to this source, no. The text actually says the Church of Rome admits to changing the day of worship from the seventh-day Saturday to the first day.
So going back to our unbroken thread concept, did the thread snap here? If the main organized church went into this midnight and changed the rules, was the original DNA lost?
No, and that is the crucial point of this section. The source emphasizes that a faithful remnant always existed. Even in the darkest times, when the institution had compromised, there were groups of people who kept the original faith and, crucially, hallowed the true Sabbath.
So you have this massive institutional power suppressing these ideas. But you can't really kill an idea, right?
Right.
Especially not when people are willing to hide in the freezing cold to protect it. Which brings us to the resistance. The text spotlights a group called the Waldenses.
The Waldenses are portrayed as the heroes of this era.
I love the visual the text paints here. It says they live behind the lofty bulwarks of the mountains. We're talking about the Alps.
Natural fortress.
Imagine that life, living in caves or high valleys, hiding from armies. And the text says they were a hiding place for the truth. Because they were hidden away, they were able to keep the light of truth burning for 1,000 years. And get this, they were among the first to have a translation of the Bible in their own language.
That access to scripture is the recurring theme of the resistance. It starts in the mountains with the Waldenses, but then it spreads. The manual does a sort of roll call of the reformers.
It's like a hall of fame.
Yeah.
But instead of sports stats, it's about how much trouble they caused the establishment. You've got John Wycliffe.
The morning star of the Reformation. He started giving the English people the Bible, and that was a dangerous act.
Then you have John Huss and Jerome,
who were influenced by Wycliffe. They paid the ultimate price burned at the stake. But their death sparked even more resistance.
And then we have to talk about the heavy hitter. Martin Luther. You can't talk about this history without him.
No, you can't. The text zooms in on that cinematic moment. October 31st, 1517, the Wittenberg Castle church door.
I always picture him with a hammer, just pounding these 95 Theses onto the door while everyone watches.
It changed the world. But the text focuses on his internal realization. The just shall live by faith.
Right.
That contradicted the prevailing system of the time, which was all about penance and buying indulgences, and his refusal to retract his writings is legendary. Here I stand, I can do no other.
And he translated the Bible into German. Again, getting the book to the people. But it wasn't just him. The manual lists so many others.
Oh, yeah.
Melanchthon, Calvin in France, John Knox in Scotland. It portrays this as a synchronized European-wide awakening.
Driven by the printing press and the Bible, but then the scene shifts. We leave Europe.
Why?
Because in Europe, even with the Reformation, there was still persecution.
So it keeps moving. It crosses the Atlantic.
To the Pilgrim Fathers, September 1620, the Mayflower.
They were looking for religious liberty. And the text connects this directly to Roger Williams, who established Rhode Island. It calls it the first settlement with full religious freedom.
So you see the progression. From the garden, to the desert, to the mountains of the Alps, to the coast of New England, the thread is moving.
And once it gets established there, it's like it explodes outward. We move into the era of missions. And honestly, some of these stories are wild.
They are.
Like, we have to talk about the father of modern missions, William Carey.
Carey is a great example of the humble origins of this movement. He was a shoemaker.
A shoemaker.
But he kept a map of the world on his wall while he fixed shoes. He was inspired by Captain Cook's voyages, but instead of conquering, he wanted to share the gospel. He ended up becoming the pioneer missionary to India.
And the manual lists others who followed. But there was one name that stopped me in my tracks. John G. Paton.
Ah, yes! The missionary to the South Pacific.
The text mentions a detail about him that I had to reread 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating.
Yeah.
It says his life was threatened by cannibals 53 times.
53.
I mean, after the 3rd or 4th time, don't you just pack up the boat? Okay, guys, clearly not welcome here. I'm going home.
It really highlights the intensity of their conviction. They didn't see this as a job. They saw it as a life-or-death rescue mission. They believed they were carrying that same thread of truth we talked about earlier to the ends of the earth.
It's incredible resilience.
Yeah.
But, okay, we've traced this thread all the way to modern times. And this is where the Church Heritage Manual lands its biggest argument. It introduces this concept called the remnant.
This is really the climax of Section 1. And to explain it, the manual uses an analogy of a bolt of cloth.
Okay, I actually love this analogy. It's so simple, but it explains their whole worldview.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a big roll, a bolt of fabric.
Yep.
You have the very first piece at the beginning of the roll, and you have the very last piece at the end. That last piece is the remnant.
And the logic is the texture and the pattern of the remnant must be identical to the piece at the beginning.
If the pattern changes in the middle, like all those changes we talked about during the Dark Ages, the remnant doesn't follow that new pattern.
No.
It skips over the middle and matches the beginning.
Exactly. So, applying this to history, the remnant church, the group at the very end of history, must have the same beliefs and practices as the apostolic church at the beginning.
So all those changes, the hierarchy, the different day of worship, the pagan rites, those are the changes in the pattern that this group rejects.
Right. They are trying to get back to the original source code. The text lists specific characteristics that they believe identify this remnant based on the book of Revelation.
It's basically a checklist. Let's run through it, but I need you to translate some of this because it gets a little jargon heavy. First, it says they keep the commandments of God.
That goes back to the harmony of law and grace we discussed in the beginning. They believe the 10 Commandments, including the Sabbath, are still binding.
Okay. Second, it says they have the testimony of Jesus, which the text defines as the spirit of prophecy. Hold on. Spirit of prophecy. That sounds mysterious. What does the text actually mean by that in practical terms?
It's a specific term they use. Practically, it means they believe that the gift of prophecy, God, speaking through prophets, didn't end in the Bible times.
Oh, interesting.
They believe that gift is restored in the remnant church to guide it at the end of time.
Got it. So, commandments and prophecy. Then there's the message they proclaim, the 3 angels' messages. And it mentions Babylon. Again, help me out here. Are we talking about ancient Iraq?
No, in this context, Babylon is a symbol. In the Bible, Babylon represents confusion or a mixture of truth and error. So when the text says they announce the fall of Babylon, it means they are exposing religious confusion and calling people away from those compromised doctrines we talked about earlier.
So it's a call to clarity.
Yes.
Yeah.
a call to separate from tradition and go back to the Bible. The manual makes a point about the word Protestant. It says the remnant is supposed to put the protest back in Protestant.
Meaning protesting against substituting tradition for Bible truth. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. You might think this text is saying, we are the only people in the world who matter. Everyone else is wrong. It sounds exclusive, but the text explains it differently.
That is a crucial nuance. The source explicitly states that God's people are currently found in all religious persuasions.
All religious persuasions. So they aren't claiming they are the only ones with a connection to God.
No, but the text describes a call. It says, these people who are scattered everywhere are being called to come out of spiritual Babylon. It's an invitation to align with that original pattern before the end of history.
So the argument is, you're God's child, but you're in a system that has changed the pattern. Come back to the original pattern.
Precisely. It views history not as a random series of events, but as a movement towards a final restoration of that original truth from Eden.
It really is a sweeping view of history. When you step back and look at it, from the Garden of Eden through the patriarchs, the apostles, hiding in the caves of the Alps with the Waldenses, standing with Luther at the church door, sailing with the Pilgrims, dodging cannibals in the South Pacific with Peyton, it's epic.
It is, and it ties all those disparate elements into a single narrative arc.
Right.
It suggests that all those struggles were about preserving that one specific thread of truth so it could be fully restored at the end.
It makes you look at history differently. Instead of just dates and wars, it's a struggle over an idea.
And that leads to a fascinating question for the listener to consider, based on the logic of this text. If the remnant piece of cloth must look exactly like the beginning piece.
The apostolic piece.
Right. If that's the standard, what traditions or habits might modern culture or even modern Christianity have added over the centuries that don't actually match that original pattern?
That is a provocative thought. It's like an audit. We're holding on to all this stuff, but if we held it up against the original, would it match?
It forces you to audit your own beliefs against that original standard.
Well, that is a lot to chew on. We have traced the thread from the beginning to the end, at least according to the Church Heritage Manual.
It has been quite a journey.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. To our listener, the learner, we hope this gave you a clear picture of this specific historical worldview. Keep pulling on those threads of history. You never know where they might lead.
Until next time.
See you then.